Aloha and welcome to our first video on animals, the Invertebrate 1 video. In this video, we will describe the 8 common features of organisms in the kingdom Animalia, so what makes them an animal. And then finally, we will describe features of sponges, nidarians, flatworms, roundworms, and segmented worms. Okay, let's begin our discussion of the kingdom Animalia by going over the 8 features of animals. These are the 8 characteristics that make them an animal. The first is they are heterotrophs, which means they're not able to make their own food, so they have to ingest or consume food to get their energy to carry out their functions. They also have coordinated movement, which means they move around because they have muscle cells, and these muscle cells are governed or coordinated by the nerve cells, so they know what they're doing. They are multicellular, they have more than one cell. They are diploid, so they're going to have 2 copies of each chromosome, one from the male parent and one from the female parent. They do reproduce sexually. They develop what we call a blastula, and that's a hollow ball of cells that'll then form 3 layers, and from this we develop into the entire organism. They don't have any rigid cell walls, and they do have tissues. So animal cells are going to be organized into groups that'll work together. We'll talk more about the tissues and the organ systems a little bit later on in this course. Okay, so let's start exploring the phyla of the animal kingdom. The first one that we'll talk about is the porifera, or the sponges. And you can see a picture of a natural sponge over here. Most of the sponges have the same basic body shape, but they'll change it up a little bit. What they'll have is a central cavity that you see here, and they'll have a bunch of pores. And into the pores is where this water will flow into here in the central cavity and circulate around a little bit, and then it'll flow out of one exit pore. And you can see these large exit pores over here. So if you were able to track the water near this picture, you'd see that the water is being flowed through the sponge this way. And as it flows through, they kind of filter out the stuff in the water, and that's how they feed. Now, our sponges, the way the water flows is because they have these choanocytes, or these collar cells, and what they'll have is this flagellum, and all the flagellum inside will beat, and that'll pull water inside because these beating flagella are pushing the water out. So it's kind of making a hole that'll fill up with water from the outside, and that's how they get their food inside. So those are our sponges. Okay, the next phylum is the nidarians. And the nidarians are made up of our jellyfish, our sea anemones, our corals, and our hydras. And there's a lot of interesting things about the nidarians. They have 2 different stages of life. They have a medusa stage, which is kind of like what we see in a jellyfish, where they'll have a mouth that leads into a central cavity here. They'll have 2 tissue layers here, and then they have these tentacles, and they'll swim around. They're mobile animals in the medusa stage. The medusa will then land and forms the polyp stage, and it's kind of like if we took the medusa and stuck it to a rock upside down. We can see these 2 layers here. The mouth is here, our central cavity here, and then the tentacles are going to be out this way. Now, one other interesting thing about the nidarians are the fact they have these nemocysts here, and these are basically these stinging cells. So if you know the jellyfish can sting, corals can sting, sea anemones can sting, even the hydras can sting. The reason they do this is because of these nemocysts here. And what they do is they'll have these charged up little cells here, and that's before it discharges. So they'll either have a physical, mechanical trigger there, so if you brush up against it, it can sting you, or it can be a chemical trigger or a temperature trigger, but somehow or another it's going to have something there. And what will happen is these cells will fill with water, and it'll force out this little thread here, and the end of the thread is where you'll see a bunch of different things, where it can be just a simple little opening at the end, and it'll inject out poison that way. Some of them are going to look a little bit more like a Christmas tree kind of point here, and that'll actually go in and stick, and it'll continue to release poison that way. And then other ones are just kind of be this like twisted hook that'll just go out and hold on to it. So they have a bunch of these different stinging cells, but that's one of the things that makes the nidarians special. Okay, we're going to discuss 3 different phyla that are kind of related. These are the vermiforms, or the worms basically. The platyhelminthes are often called the flatworms, and those are the ones that are going to make up the most of it. They're also the flukes and the tapeworms we see down here, and they're called this because they're kind of flattened out as an organism. They have bilateral symmetry, which means that you can cut them down the middle and one side's the same as the other. And when we look at our flatworm over here, what we'll notice is they have eye spots. So they do have the ability to see light and dark. They can't probably make images. They don't have a true brain. They have a ganglia instead. They'll have nerve cords that you can see, and then they kind of have this entering here where they'll feed. So the flatworms are just like a squished out kind of a worm, kind of basic, kind of simple. You don't see a lot of differentiation in the Platyhelminthes. Next up is the phylum Nematoda, or the nematodes, and these are our roundworms. And they're going to see, if you look in the picture here, they'll be smooth, round, all the way around. They have that kind of symmetry, but we're seeing a little bit more of differentiation inside of the nematode. If we take a look real quickly, we'll see a distinct mouth here and a distinct anus, so they have a one-way digestive tract going on here. They'll have a piercing device, so they'll actually extend that out to break through the skin of whatever it is that they're attacking, and then that's how they'll get inside that way to feed. They do have ovaries, so there are males and females. We can see a reproductive pore going on here, and they kind of have, like we said, a very rudimentary one-way digestive tract. And these are the roundworms. The last phylum that we're going to talk about in the worms are the annelids, and these are our segmented worms. And what that means is that the worm on the outside, you can see how it's broken down into these little segments here, these little different pieces. And you can see, once again, what we're noticing is a mouth here, an anus here, so it's a one-way digestive tract. It's a little bit better developed. They have a gizzards, intestines, stomach, kind of, sort of. You'll see that they have the rudimentary portions of a heart here. It's basically a bunch of pumping vessels that'll go there. They have a little bit of a cerebral ganglia. Wouldn't necessarily call it a brain, but it's close. And then they have these ganglia that go down the whole way. Now there's three different annelid classes that we like to talk about. The one that you're probably most familiar with from the picture here will be the Oligochaeta. These are the earthworms, and the earthworms have these segments, as you can see. Another group is the Hierodinea, or the leeches, and if you ever have a leech and you have a look at it, you can see that it is actually a segmented worm. And then there's the polychaete worms, and these are the marine worms. And I have a picture of a feather duster here, and then we have a fireworm down here, and you can see the segments here. The feather duster, it actually lives inside of a sheath that it produces, but if you could see the worm, you would see that it's segmented there as well. Okay, so let's summarize what we've learned about the animal kingdom so far. We talked about 5 different phyla so far. The first one was the porifera, and these are our sponges. And our sponges had a body wall of 2 cell layers. They had pores which water flew into and canals which water flew out. We didn't see any tissues or organs in the porifera. They lived in the water, and they basically made their living from straining food from the water. Next up were the nidarians, and these were our jellyfish, corals, sea anemones. And these ones had a bag-like body of 2 cell layers. So they had like a bag of a body there with one opening, and that led into this hollow cavity. We started to see tissues here, and we saw radial symmetry, and it's also where we saw the nemocysts, or the stinging cells. Next up were the flatworms, or the Platyhelminthes, and our example would be like our tapeworms here. They had a flat, thin body, hence the name flatworm. We see 3 cell layers and organs. Now, they did have a digestive system, but their digestive system has one opening. So everything came in one way and went out one way, kind of a rudiment from the nidarians that we saw earlier. They did have a nervous system, and they had bilateral symmetry, which means that if you cut them in half, you had a right and a left side. Up next are the nematodes, or the roundworms, and our example would be our hookworm. And they had a round, slender body to them, and here we see a digestive system with 2 openings, so it's a one-way digestive system. They had a little bit more developed nervous system, and again, they have bilateral symmetry. And finally, that brought us to our last phylum in this video, and those were the annelids, or the segmented worms. They were kind of round, and they have a segmented body. That's the key. They do have a fully functional digestive system and a nervous system, and they start seeing the beginnings of a circulatory system. They do have this bilateral symmetry as well, and we notice that these ones here are not parasitic. These ones aren't feeding off something else or relying on something else. These are actually able to live on their own. And we talked about our examples being the earthworm, or the polychaete marine worms, or leeches. So that's it for this video. Good luck with the lessons, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.